That's convenient.
You there? Oh, wait.
Oh, hey, how's it going? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, one sec. I gotta change my sound settings.
Okay. How well can you hear me as well?
I can hear you perfectly well. How well can you hear me?
Very well.
Yeah, I got my new headphones that aren't broken.
Nice.
Hopefully that'll help.
Yeah, that should make for a much more, well, I don't know, a better conversation.
Easier conversation.
Yeah, easier. That's the word.
So did you get a chance to watch my YouTube video? The one about the fairies and whatever I titled it? Fallen Cups and Devious Fairies?
In all honesty, I might have, but I can't remember. That was a couple weeks ago, right? Or
Yeah.
at least a few weeks ago. Yeah. I do not remember what it was about, but if you go over it, we can certainly discuss the points that you went over.
All right, well, the main point was just there are infinitely many ways to explain anything, which also applies to free will. So maybe free will is a philosophical primitive like you were arguing, or maybe it's an illusion like I was arguing, and it could also be things like a composite of things we don't understand yet, or an emergent property of things we do know about, we just don't understand how they function yet. So there's lots and lots of ways to explain what free will could be. Are you with me so far?
Yes, absolutely.
And you would agree with that? Would you contend with any of that?
I think I would agree with that. I mean, in the, thinking there could be infinite, I don't know, infinitely many ways to kind of explain what we call free will, or like
if free will exists and is a thing, then there are infinitely many ways to explain what caused it, what created it, why it exists, those kinds of questions.
Oh, if free will as free will legitimately is a real thing and actually exists in the world, then there would be an infinite amount of ways that kind of you could possibly go about explaining how it actually does come about.
Yeah, or you could just say it's an illusion, which I would qualify as another additional explanation of it. But yeah.
Okay, I don't know if if the infinite explanations are about an actually existing free will, and we're talking about the nature of how that free will, I don't know, got there or works or something like that, then I don't necessarily know that I would add the illusion option to those other options, because it seems like all the other options are working, on the assumption at least that free will exists, whereas this is explicitly a denial of free will.
Yeah, absolutely. This is just more of a general idea that there are just infinitely many ways to explain that phenomenon.
Okay.
Maybe it exists, maybe it doesn't exist, and those are two of the possibilities.
Yeah, okay.
All right, and so I can pick whichever one of these explanations I want, and I can tie it into my preferred theory. Instead of being in theism, it could be deism or pantheism or naturalistic pantheism. And so I can explain free will from any of these different worldviews. Would you agree with that?
Probably, yeah. I mean, I'll grant it, certainly.
And this doesn't just apply to free will, it also applies to morality and consciousness and purpose and meaning, the fine-tuning of the universe, the origin of the universe. Pretty much every philosophical argument can be explained by any of these worldviews, by these multitude of ways to explain any of these phenomena.
Yeah. If for infinite explanations, if that was just like, if you tweak some tiny thing, just a tiny bit, that counts as another explanation. You tweak it again a tiny bit, that would count as an explanation. I think you could get, you know, infinite amounts of explanations, possible explanations. But I don't know that, like, when it comes to free will, uh, it's like there, at least in my head, which is not huge. At least in my head, I can really, only think of a select number of ways that free will might be explained away. I mean, like, if we go into those ways, then we can say that, let's say the idea of it being an illusion and it being a kind of neurochemical process or whatnot. Um, I might say that one explanation is it's a neurological process that happens in this part of the brain, and that another explanation could be, well, it's a neurological process which happens in this slightly different other part of the brain. And so something like that. So, I mean, like that, you could get infinite amounts of explanations. But I don't know that those two explanations are so kind of different that it almost sounds like the same explanation, just the details are um a bit more refined or picked apart or something like that.
Sure, we can break these infinitely many minute variations down into bigger categories. Like, for example, free will could be a philosophical primitive, and that would be a category, and there could be different kinds of philosophical primitives, and it could be an illusion, and there
Right.
could be different kinds of illusions.
Right.
And the other main ones I've thought of so far are, it could be a composite of things we haven't discovered yet, or it could be an emergent property of things we do know of. So those are the big four
Okay.
categories I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, certainly. And so as far as categories, I don't know that there's necessarily an infinite number of like different uh categories, perhaps, if that's the best word, that free will could be explained under. Or they're kind of, I think the explanations are infinite in the sense that, like you said, you can kind of eternally pick them apart and make distinctions and do things like that. But
Yeah,
nevertheless, I will definitely grant that in that sense, there are undoubtedly an infinite number of slightly different ways you could explain free will if it exists.
and we have the major four categories are the ones I'm focusing on for the moment. It's just there are these big
Yeah.
ways, big different ways that can explain free will.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And I can pick whichever one of these I want and tie it into my preferred metaphysical theory and say I now have an objective grounds for free will.
Well, I mean, you you have that psychological capability. You're capable of doing that. But I suppose that if and I think this might be what you're getting at ultimately, is that
We
I
need
don't.
some criteria to differentiate between which one is the best explanation.
Right. Right.
And
Yes.
so then I would go, what is your criteria, or what indicates that your explanation of a philosophical primitive is more likely than any of these others?
Um Well, I think it would have to be. I don't know that I have, thought of any kind of overarching criteria to apply that applies to all of these different things that can, almost like a checklist or a scale or something of like, does this do this better? Does this do this better? Or something like that. But I think that, like I said before, with free will, it seems like, because free will is something that we feel so accustomed to, and that it really quite it resonates so much with our actual like experience of the world, it's ingrained so fundamentally within us that I think it would be similar to me kind of, if we're going to say that it's an illusion or something, the kind of free will exists versus free will doesn't exist, that kind of a thing. I think I would believe in free will in the same way that I would believe in the, objective physical world. I don't know that I could give an argument for why the objective physical world, must be there, why it's not an illusion, why I'm not being stimulated by, my brain isn't being stimulated by a mad scientist to think that this is all there. But nevertheless, my kind of seeming interaction with everything is kind of ingrained within me as, that this physical world really actually is here. And so I would place free will on a kind of par with that and say that if someone wants to say that free will is an illusion, and that we are kind of hopelessly mistaken into thinking that free will is a real thing, then there would need to be a good argument for that. Similar to how if there was someone who wanted to say that, we're living in the Matrix or anything, that the objective world does not exist, I think that they would have to,
Need a burden of proof.
Yeah, provide a good argument as to that. I think, I can't remember if I mentioned it last time or not, but actually, I'm pretty sure I did. But I do, resonate with some aspects of like Alvin Plantinga's
Properly basic.
Properly Basic. Yeah, because I think that does truly reflect how we hold beliefs, or at least some beliefs, like the objective world.
So from my perspective, I think the difference between the external world and free will is the scientific method of making predictions. I think it's reasonable to believe there is an external world because it makes testable predictions, where I believe it's not reasonable to believe in free will because it doesn't make testable predictions. So for me, free will is more like an illusion, something that we seem to feel, but there's no real way to say it actually exists. To say something actually exists, you would need that testable predictions criteria to meet that, from my perspective.
Well, I don't think that you could establish that the objective world exists simply based off of the testable predictions theory. The testable predictions, that can only work if it's already assumed that the objective world exists. Science wouldn't prove that the objective world exists. It needs it needs the assumption that the objective world exists to even go forward. And so
I understand what you're saying, but I would
Yeah.
disagree. I would, I think I told you last time about my epistemological approach, which is when I'm imagining a unicorn, there is some difference between my imagination and my experience, because I'm not going to experience a unicorn just by imagining one.
Yes. Yeah.
And from that, because we can know there's some difference between my imagination and my experience, we know there are lots of things I can imagine independent of my experience, like math and logic and language, and that I'm 30 feet tall or whatever. And we know that there are certain things that we can experience that are still a part of our imagination, like illusions and biases and fallacies. And so we need some criteria to differentiate between the imagination, the imaginatory world, and the experiential world. And I call that science. And so whatever science deems is a part of the experiential world is the objective external world from my perspective. Now, whether or not that is actually some kind of metaphysical thing that exists doesn't matter to my model. So as far as I can tell, science doesn't have to care about objective reality in the way that you're using objective.
Well, I suppose in that case, I kind of just see that as redefining what we're actually talking about, or really essentially not talking about the same thing. Because, when I make the statement that we kind of hold it as properly basic that the objective world exists. I mean, something that really it's rather difficult to define the objective world, but I essentially am talking about that thing that people generally believe based off of our experience, that there is this thing independent of us, completely independent of us, completely independent of what we are thinking, that just kind of can exist or not exist without us. And we all have this kind of, properly basic belief that that is the case. And so in you differentiating what you say, the imaginary versus the experiential, I don't know that I would actually, I suppose the difference between those two, the imaginary and the experiential, I don't necessarily see that. Even if you grant, you tell the difference between what is imaginary and what is experiential, I still don't think that would get you kind of the properly basic thing that people generally
Yeah.
accept. Now, granted, I realize that this whole thing I'm saying boils down to, an appeal to everybody else and, all of our experience, and we all believe that the objective world exists. Certainly, I'm not necessarily saying that everybody believes the objective world exists, therefore that's some kind of proof that the objective world really does exist. I'm just saying that, because it is our experience, just a fundamental kind of immediate part of our experience, that the objective world exists, that there is really something that I'm interacting with outside of myself. It seems like for someone to object to that and to say, no, it's actually not independent of you, that would take a lot. And the distinction between imaginary versus experiential, I think the reason why I don't think that that really gets you what is got at, if you'll put it that way, with the properly basic belief in the objective world, is that both what is imaginary and what is experiential, I mean, those have an aspect which is just utterly inseparable from yourself. And so if we're saying that everything, that, you know, experiential stuff or whatnot is kind of, I don't know, that can be the link to what I'm talking about, which seems properly basic. I don't know that it necessarily does provide that link,
Yeah, you're
because
absolutely right. The whole point I'm leading into is the fact that there are two different definitions of reality here. And one is the theist definition of reality, and one is the scientific definition of reality. And I think there's a big difference between these two. From the scientific perspective, reality is just that experiential world, regardless of whether or not it's objectively true in the way that I think you're using the word objective. So just to clarify, what do you mean by objective? Can you give me a brief definition?
I suppose just person independent.
So can something be false, but we just don't know it yet, and be objective? Like, for example, I am holding a cup, but if we're in the matrix, then the cup doesn't exist. Is the cup still objective?
If you are holding the cup,
Yeah. Like,
and
but we're in the matrix.
but we're all in the matrix, right?
Yeah. You've seen the movie The Matrix, right? Just to,
Yes. Oh yeah,
okay.
yeah,
Okay.
certainly. Is the cup objective?
Well, it's just a bunch of ones and zeros in the matrix. So does it objectively exist in the way that you're using objective?
Huh. Well, interesting. Yeah, that's a good point you raised there. That's difficult to answer. My first instinct might be to say yes, actually, that it is objective. Because it would depend, it seems like it would depend on, it's outside of me or whatnot, or my consciousness. Well, goodness sake, that's a difficult one.
Well, let me phrase it to you this way. Would it be subjective to the matrix, but not objective to the true nature of reality?
Oh, well, I guess if you want to put it from the Matrix's point of view, then I would say, yeah, it's subjective.
And another way to think about it would be like the brain in a vat. Maybe we're just all in somebody else's dream or something, and the same problem would apply. So the cup would just be subjective to whatever is containing the cup. Like if it's the matrix, it's subjective to the matrix, or if it's a brain, it's subjective to the brain.
Right.
And so by objective, what you seem to mean is the fundamental true nature of reality. That's what theists seem to mean when they say objective.
I suppose so. I'll go with that definition.
All right. So from the scientific perspective, that's metaphysics, which is totally irrelevant. No one in science cares about any of that. From the scientific perspective, objective just means independent of our personal biases, pretty much. So the fact that we can use testable predictions to verify something exists, it's objective. So if we have a water bottle in the matrix and we can use testable predictions that I'm thirsty, and when I drink from this water bottle, I will not be thirsty, this water bottle is objective. It doesn't matter if it's in the matrix or not. So the scientific perspective starts from a bottom-up worldview of this is what we experience, or this is what we imagine, this is what we experience, and there's some difference between these two things. Whereas the theist worldview seems to start from a top-down perspective of here is the absolute fundamental nature of reality, and that's what objectivity is, and then everything else is subjective to that. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but then I think you're just talking about, I don't think that this is necessarily, if we even want to put it, the scientific conception of objectivity versus the theistic or maybe philosophical notion of objectivity. I think ultimately you're comparing apples and oranges there, because
these are two different worldviews, and I'm trying to, because we're using the same language.
Well, right, but it's not. I don't think it has anything to do with the worldview. It's just quite literally we're using the same word and it's just meaning two different things. Because I mean, the theist can also say that, something is objective if, I mean, for me, I am being objective if I'm not letting my personal biases get in the way or something like that. The theist can just as easily say that.
Yeah, as a scientist, I could say that there is an objective metaphysical reality that is pantheism. So we can both use both terminologies. That's not the point I'm trying to lead into.
Right. Yeah.
So the point I'm trying to lead into is that there are different criteria for these two different kinds of objectivity. The burden of proof for these is very different. Does that
what two different types of objectivity? Because one of the examples, I mean, what I just said was the example of me being objective.
Oh, shit, 1 second.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, I'm back.
Alrighty.
So just to pause right there for a minute. I'm not trying to say that one of these definitions is more right or more less than the other. So we can just refer to them as like empirical objectivity versus metaphysical objectivity or whatever. They're just topics to talk about. I'm not saying one is right or one is wrong.
Yeah. And well, also this is kind of the other thing though that was kind of confusing me or making me have a strange look on my face, if you could see my face, is that, like, I mean, a definition can't be true or false. Like, that's just kind of a category thing. Like, you use definitions to express meaning and whatnot. But whether I define objective as utterly person independent, or I define objective as just kind of not letting my biases get in the way, it's not like there's a right way to define objective, or a wrong way. It's just you get your terms straight from the beginning with the person you're talking to, so that you know that, okay, we're talking about the same thing here. So you could use whatever kind of label or whatnot you want to use, whatever word, but it's just like to get on the same page that, okay, we're talking about the same thing here. So, I mean, yeah, you could use objective in those different ways. But going back to what you said something about there being a differential burden of,
different burden of proof for
yeah.
these two different kinds of objectivity.
What do you mean by that?
So, for example, from the scientific perspective, reality is just that which we can verify with testable predictions. So the fact that I'm holding the cup in the matrix, it is reality. Now, whether or not it's metaphysical or the absolute fundamental nature of reality is irrelevant to science, because science doesn't care about any of that. Reality to science is just that which we can verify with testable predictions, and there isn't anything beyond that. Whereas from the theist perspective, reality is that fundamental true nature of reality thing, and if it's in the matrix, well, then it's just subjective, and that's not objective in the way that they mean it.
Yeah, and so I think that it kind of was my impression that there was almost a competition between those two things, or that there needs to be a competition between those two things, as if there's either you have one or you have the other. But I guess what I'm saying is that, I mean, I could just accept both, and the reason I could accept both is because fundamentally I think that I don't think it's true that science has an inherent view of what reality is. I don't think that through the workings of science you could come to figure out that reality is just our experiential, or our experiences. I don't think that science is the nature of science is not something that can.
You're absolutely right. That is exactly correct. And so my point is that these are three different tiers of knowledge, is what I call them. First is the imaginary or the conceptual. Second is the empirical, verifiable stuff. And then the third is this fundamental true nature of reality stuff. And these are three different tiers of knowledge. They don't cancel each other out. Science isn't better than the other one. They're just want to outline these three tiers as separate tiers of knowledge. That's my goal.
Okay. But I suppose, again, I'm a little hesitant to say that, there's a kind of scientific view of what reality is, and then there's a kind of higher level view of what reality is. I think that ultimately what science and what this kind of, I don't know, higher view or whatnot, it seems like it's more about kind of, it almost reminds me of Plato, and like it's more like levels of being, different types of being, where you could have the kind of just imaginary realm, which is utterly subjective and utterly, related to myself, the experiential reality, which, in all honesty, I mean, I do believe that. Oh no, I see what you're getting at. I do believe that experiential is also subjective in nature, that the experiences are subjective, though the experiences might be, the stimuli for the experiences might be external, but the experiences themselves are something subjective within me. That doesn't mean that I can, like, decide what I'm going to experience, because again, like you said, that's the difference between imaginary and experiential is that I might, I might, in this loose, not to imply any kind of free will or any stance on that, but I might choose to think about a panda or something, but that doesn't mean that, I can experience the panda in the same way. But nevertheless, I think that the imagining and the experiencing are both fundamentally,
subjective in your worldview.
yes, subjective.
I would absolutely agree. Just like you said, science can't fundamentally say anything about the fundamental true nature of reality. It just doesn't have the ability to get there.
Well, no. What I was saying was that science, by its nature, is not in a place to kind of define what reality is. As in science, works, as you obviously know, on, I have a hypothesis and just experiments and testing and all of that. But like, I think when we're talking about, what fundamental reality is, or what reality is in general, objective reality, that is something that it's almost like that label is something that we would agree on a kind of definition for, like person independent or whatnot, and then perhaps try and reason or make arguments for why such a thing may or may not exist. But I don't think that science can. I don't think that science can tell us what that definition of objective reality should be.
I agree, but I'm just saying science is using a different definition than the theist definition. Again, just like the tiers of knowledge, I'm not saying one is right or one is wrong. These are just different definitions. And science's definition of reality is the empirically verifiable, and there's nothing beyond that. If it can't be empirically verifiable, then it's just imaginary, most likely. Whereas the theist is saying there is something beyond this experiential, verifiable stuff. There is this fundamental true nature of reality.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, sure.
All right. And so the epistemology of science starts with this is imaginary, and then we have this criteria to determine whether or not something exists in the experiential world. And then the theist says there is this some other thing outside of this, the true fundamental nature of reality. So we need some additional criteria to determine which things are of that category.
Again, I don't think so, because the differences in categories here aren't like, substance dualists might think of the differences between mind and body or something like that. The differences between these categories, like you said, seems to be something that that do not necessarily cancel each other out. They're kind of part of the same system, essentially. And so to say that, science on the one hand, the definition of objective reality on the kind of, I don't know, according to science is, something, the experiential reality that we have. And then, science can't prove that there is something further than that. Sure. Yeah. I agree with that. But then again, I don't actually think that it is science which even proves the, I don't know, experiential aspect of what we call reality. I don't even think that it can prove that much. Because that, again, the kind of the existence of experiential reality is not something gathered by science. That's just kind of an immediate thing that experiencers experience. And yeah, so I guess that's my main kind of like point of
I completely agree with you. It's not at any.
confusion.
I'm totally agree.
Okay.
So science only tells us the difference between the imaginary stuff and the experiential stuff. That's all science does. It just stops at that. It doesn't prove, maybe the stuff we're experiencing could just be a deeper level of our mind we haven't discovered yet, like the idealist argues, or maybe we're in the matrix and it's just not real at all. It's just a bunch of ones and zeros. Maybe we're in a theistic universe. Maybe we're in a pantheistic universe. It could all be a delusion from Descartes' demon. There are tons of possibilities of what the experiential world could be metaphysically, but that's a different
Yes.
question. All
Yes.
science cares about is here is what we imagine, here is what we experience, and this is the criteria we use to differentiate between those. And beyond that, what the experiential reality actually isn't a question science even attempts to answer.
Yeah. I can agree with that.
And theists are trying to answer that question, the one that science hasn't attempted to answer.
Yeah, I you'd agree with that as well.
So as a scientist, I can say I can also assert answers to this question. Like instead of theism, I can go with pantheism or naturalistic pantheism or cosmism, transtheism, all those other options. So
Yeah.
scientists could also try to answer this question. But from a scientific perspective, there's no difference between any of these asserted answers. They're all just kind of made up. And all the things that theists use to indicate this absolute true fundamental nature of reality, the free will, consciousness, morality, anybody can assert that those are grounded in any of these metaphysical theories, like naturalistic pantheism. And as far
Right.
as I can tell, there's no difference at all between the assertion of naturalistic pantheism and the assertion of theism. Both can answer every single argument that theists provide equally from my perspective. And that's why scientists just say, well, we don't really have a way to get to there, so we just omit it. It's irrelevant. Either things are imaginary or they are experiential, because we have a criteria to differentiate between these two, but we don't have a criteria to differentiate between either of those two and the metaphysical. So we just have to ignore the metaphysical for now.
Well, you have to, in the purview of science, you need to do your experiments not with the goal of trying to get at that level of reality. It's not that there's some kind of assumption or anything like that. And I think you probably said the same thing earlier, that there's no assumption that, this other thing doesn't exist, or that it does exist. It's just kind of outside the scope of science.
I'll apologize. Let me clarify. It absolutely exists. There is absolutely a true fundamental nature of reality out there. We just can't say anything about what it is, other than I think, therefore I
am. So that is a kind of interesting statement in that it reminds me of Kant, in his distinction of like the
noumenal and the phenomenal.
Exactly. And to say that there is this realm, the subjective realm of kind of the real or whatnot, the actual, objective world, but we don't know anything about it.
Or we don't have the basis to prove anything about it. We don't have any way to differentiate between that noumenal objective world and just something that we're subjectively experiencing. We can't tell the difference between these two things yet.
Okay. Yeah. I suppose I'm just a little hesitant to say that we can't know anything about the noumenal realm, because it seems like that itself, to say that we don't know anything about the noumenal realm, it seems to me that itself is a statement which really is true or really is false. And it seems like if we're going to accept that statement as true, then we're not just going to accept it as, well, to all appearances, it's true. It seems like we hold that as really objectively true. It seems like that is kind of a noumenal truth, something that is just true independent of us. And so it's almost like to say that we can't know anything about the noumenal realm is itself a claim that is made about the noumenal realm, about the
I
nature of the noumenal realm.
I don't think so. That's a claim about our knowledge. Like if I say I'm holding a bottle of water, that's not a claim about the fundamental nature of reality, because if I'm in the matrix, I'm still holding a bottle of water from my appearances. So from my appearances, we can't know anything about the noumenal realm. It's a
I
statement about our knowledge, not a statement about reality itself.
I would disagree that if you are holding, you know, if you're in the matrix and you're having this experience of holding a water bottle, I don't think it's true to say that that kind of is that you actually are holding a water bottle.
Oh, I agree. I'm just, it appears to me as if I'm holding a water bottle, but because I'm in the matrix, it is false. There is no water bottle. It's just an appearance. So the
Yes.
apparent reality and the objective reality are two separate things. So if I say we apparently can't know anything about objective reality, that's one of the things, like that's true in the matrix. That's true from my appearance. That's true from my limited knowledge, the subjective truth, not. And so it's not actually a claim about reality itself. It's only a claim about what I can apparently do. It's like the claim of me holding a water bottle. It's subjective, not
But
objective.
but see, even there, if we are going to say that, I am experiencing something, or I feel like I am holding a water bottle or something. It seems like we are making a claim about reality, like actual reality as reality really is. That you really, actually, truly do feel like you're holding a water bottle.
Sure, and that's connected to the only absolute truth that we do know, which is I think, therefore I am.
Oh, do you, I'm just curious. Are you a rationalist?
I don't know. Maybe.
Oh, it's just like, there's that huge debate between like Hume and Descartes with empiricism versus rationalism.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm not. No.
Yeah, okay. Well, because okay, yeah. Never mind. Uh, uh,
So,
yeah, but the certainty, though, I guess what I'm saying is that our, you know, experiential reality or whatnot definitely seems to be, it's true that I think I am holding a water bottle. That means it's true in reality, in real, true reality. It is true that I feel like I'm holding a water bottle. And so, in that sense, we are saying something about real, actual, objective reality that kind of, from the standpoint of maybe capital R reality, I really do feel like this is happening. And so it is a statement about kind of something going on in the real world.
absolutely, but you would still experience that even if you were in the matrix. It would still seem just
Yes.
as real. So there's
Yes,
no way to
certainly.
differentiate between, is what we are experiencing the kind of reality you're talking about, or is it just a subjective reality? Whereas science
Yeah.
doesn't have to care. Science, makes no difference whatsoever, because we still have that experiential criterion, because it only makes statements about the experiential world and just leaves out the metaphysical world.
Okay. Yeah.
So from my perspective, I think that is a more justified position, because I agree we don't have any way to differentiate between what is absolutely metaphysically true and what is just a subjective truth. And so the only thing we can say is, here's the difference between my imagination and here's the difference between my experience. And until we come up with some new criteria to determine what is metaphysically true, We can't really say anything about it. We just have to say we don't know.
So what about logical truths?
I would
Like
say,
the law of identity, something like that.
well, I would say the same thing. We can assume that it is an absolute truth, but again, I can just make up any ground for it, like a super law of nature that we haven't discovered yet. So even if we know of absolute truths, we don't have any way to say that it's grounded in this one source.
Okay, but even still, you said we have a knowledge of this absolute truth.
I'm just willing to grant that. I can challenge that too. Descartes showed that logic and math aren't necessarily logical, or aren't absolutely metaphysical truths. So I don't need to grant those. The only absolute metaphysical truth is I think, therefore I am.
I
You want me to explain more?
well, I would love a defense of that.
Sure.
Specifically, though, logical laws, and furthermore, I was hang on just a second, because I was actually thinking about Descartes a lot recently. And oh shoot, I unplugged something. I can't hear you.
I can hear you.
Okay, hang on 10 seconds.
I'll just keep making noise until you can hear me.
Where is it? Let's see. There it is. Yeah. Ooh, okay, it was longer than 10 seconds.
All right, can you hear me now?
Alrighty. There we go. Okay.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me
Yes.
again? All right,
Yes.
good. So, you said you were thinking about Descartes.
Yeah. Because and I legitimately would like it if you had some input or some answer to this. So you say that the kind of fundamental metaphysical truth that we can kind of have certainty of is I think, therefore I am.
Yes, that's the only one.
Okay. So at least Descartes' reasoning for that is because, of course, you know, if the demon is going to try to make me believe that I don't exist, you know, he says as hard as the demon might try, he will never be able to convince me that I don't exist, because essentially, in order for
to be convinced of anything, I must exist to think it.
Exactly. So in order to doubt my existence, I need to exist in order to doubt it. And so that was his reasoning, of course. Is that essentially your reasoning for why that is the kind of metaphysical truth that can be known?
No, the reason that's the only truth that can be known is because we necessarily experience it. The logic is irrelevant to it. It's just because we exist and we can think, we must therefore exist to be able to think, regardless of the logic, regardless of anything. The fact that we experience something is itself the only metaphysical truth.
So why is it that in order for us to doubt our own existence, why is it that we have to exist in order to be the one doubting?
I did not quite follow.
Okay. So you were perhaps maybe if you just repeat what you said before about why you believe that it is a metaphysically necessary or absolutely known metaphysical truth.
I experience stuff. That is it. That is essentially just the same thing. So I don't see I think, therefore I am as an argument. I see it as a tautology. It's saying the same thing twice. I experience, therefore I exist. They're the same thing.
Okay, so you experience, and yet what if this demon tried to tell you, no, you don't exist?
I would still experience things, even if the experience was that he told me that I don't exist, or even if the experience was that I believed I don't exist. It's still an experience. So the fact that I have experiences is itself the metaphysical truth, the only metaphysical truth.
Why? What justification do you have
The ex-
for no for right? Essentially, what I'm getting back to is why, if the demon can trick you in all of these ways, to even trick you into, let's say, believing that 2 plus 2 equals 4, when, let's say, that's actually false. Let's say that 2 plus 2 actually equals 5. And we are all just so deluded into thinking that 2 plus 2 equals 4 by this demon. If the amount of delusion can go that deep into something as what I would say is fundamentally necessary, that 2 plus 2 equals 4, if the demon can get us to doubt that, why could, and so I could be mistaken about 2 plus 2 equals 4, why would I have any confidence in my rationalization of why my experience implies that I must experience? So again, this goes back to the laws of logic, something like the law of identity. A is A.
I wouldn't even go that far. I don't even need logic. I can just say I experience, full stop. There's no logical necessity to any of that. I can completely reject all laws of logic, completely reject all laws of math, and accept the demon's argument that I don't exist. And I can fully believe I don't exist, because that's all the epistemological side, not the ontological side. I experience itself is an ontological fact, regardless of logic, regardless of math, regardless of what the demon says or what I believe. It is just a fact I experience.
Right, but do you see how the demon can
Well, yeah, the demon can convince me of anything, but what the demon convinces me of is
right?
irrelevant.
No, but the demon can convince you that your thought process is correct in thinking that, you exist.
Yep, but the fact that I experience is still true regardless of what I believe about it.
Is it though? If you're willing to give up all kind of laws of logic, then, I mean, contradictions become possible. Literally. So you think that you experience, you don't experience. Let's just say that in a world devoid of logic, in which contradictions are possible, you do not experience, despite the fact that you think you experience. And then you're going to say that, well, thinking and experiencing are fundamentally, in this way, kind of the same thing. But again, to even make that kind of statement is to kind of assert confidence in a truth other than, that I experience.
Let me come at this from a different angle. Let's say that there is a different universe out there where A does not equal A. It has a different kind of logic that we just can't understand, a different kind of system that's not even, which we would see as completely illogical.
Okay.
It could still exist, and you could exist in it, in which case you would still have experiences regardless of the law. The laws just don't matter. The experience itself isn't contingent on logic. Logic is contingent on nature, essentially. So it doesn't matter what the laws of logic are, whether or not they make sense, whether or not they're contradictions. The logic doesn't determine reality. Reality determines the logic.
But again, to say it kind of doesn't matter if there's contradictions, then I could essentially just as easily say that that logic does stem from, or reality does stem from logic, or it follows logical rules rather than the other way around. Just essentially, what leg do you have to stand on to prefer saying no, reality kind of determines logic, logic doesn't determine reality? Like in this other world, or universe rather, in this other universe, you have, different laws of logic and whatnot. But then it seemed like in your description of that, it seemed like you were making an inference or something that, we can imagine that, and that, I think therefore reality is, or logic is dependent on reality rather than reality being dependent on logic. But why? If we are already kind of throwing out logic, why does that have to be the case? Why can I not just say that logic comes first and reality comes later?
You could, but both of these are possibilities, and we don't have a way to differentiate between them. Now, of course, I can't actually express something in this alternate logic, so I have to use inferences because that's all we've got to work with. So I'm kind of stuck in that regard. But we
But
could say,
right, certainly. This is kind of the infinite loop that keeps going on and on and on, where you can eternally doubt. You simply can. If you get rid of the laws of logic, including the laws of identity, you can keep doubting forever. It doesn't matter what you get to of experiential reality. I experience that kind of thing as a fundamentally metaphysically true or metaphysically necessary statement. That in and of itself, if you're going to say that there could be a place without logic or something like that, I don't know if you are saying that, but if we're going to say that, then certainly that is epistemological. And me simply saying that you've undercut your warrant for believing that experience is a kind of metaphysical bedrock truth necessary, that doesn't mean that experience isn't a metaphysically true bedrock sort of thing. But what it does is it completely undercuts any reason you have for accepting that as a metaphysically bedrock necessity.
let me try again. So let's say we have our universe, and our universe A equals A. And we have this other universe where there's this different logic. That means that logic is the A equals A is subjective to our universe, and it's no longer a metaphysical truth.
Why?
Because there's a different logic in a different universe, so there's two different kinds of logic, and so logic isn't metaphysical. It's like in the Matrix.
No, but I mean, it's not like the Matrix, because in the Matrix, that follows the same kind of system of logic that we have.
Or I could just phrase it like this. We have the world inside of the Matrix follows A equals A logic, and then the Matrix itself is produced by some other kind of logic that we can't understand. So the world outside of the Matrix, real reality, has some completely different kind of logic we can't understand. And our logic is just our subjective experience of reality, just like me holding the cup.
Okay, but then why think that, essentially? Why?
I'm just making stuff up.
Right. No, certainly. What I'm getting at, though, is that, if there's this other universe, essentially, I'm going kind of from epistemology. I am not saying that experience is not a metaphysical bedrock. What I'm saying is that if you allow for things like the laws of logic to be doubted or to not be applicable in places, you are essentially undercutting any reason you have for believing that experience is this metaphysically necessary guarantor, pretty much. and the moment you start explaining why experience is the bedrock, why it is the metaphysical, I guess, well, the metaphysically known thing. I don't know. When you start giving a defense for why you believe that, you've already engaged in logic, so that it might be, experience might be the metaphysical kind of bedrock. It might not be, but on your kind of own admission, you would not be in a position to say that experience is that metaphysically certain thing. You could never yourself assert that with any kind of confidence in it, because it exceeds your own bounds of reasoning.
Well, it's because reason is a language. So if we're saying, could there be a world in which there is no language, and I'm trying to use language to express this to you, well, of course, I'm going to have to use language to do it. But the fact that I experience is true regardless of logic. So if we're in the matrix and our logic goes by A equals A, and the real world has this completely different logic that is nothing like what we've experienced, I still experience. I still am experiencing things right now in this moment. Even if logic is different, even if there can be contradictions, it makes no difference because I am still experiencing. So the fact that logic isn't contingent, or our experience isn't contingent on logic, because even if logic is different, I am still experiencing right now.
Well, no, but see, that's the thing, is that, again, there is this kind of unknowable aspect to it, to where, again, it might be, experience might be that thing that is still going on, or, it might not be, according your own epistemic rights do not allow you to have any kind of statement, any kind of confidence in any assertion that experience really is the metaphysical certainty that we have. Essentially, that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that experience isn't this metaphysical thing, but I'm saying that right now, in this conversation, you are stating that it is the kind of metaphysical certain thing, metaphysically certain thing. And what I'm saying is that if you are willing to say that things like logic, that we could be mistaken about them, that the demon could be tricking us, then you can have no confidence in any statement you make.
Well, I don't need any confidence. I need no rationale. I need no explanation of any kind. I can just say I experience. The fact that I experience, regardless of whether or not I can justify it or explain it, itself is true regardless of logic. Even if there is contradictory logic, even if there's a new logic outside of the matrix, it makes no difference because I am experiencing.
Yes, and
so
that's
even
why,
so you don't need logic. Logic isn't necessary to any of this.
No, but that's why I was saying I'm not saying that experience isn't the actual metaphysical kind of bedrock. I'm saying that in right now you are asserting that it is, and essentially, if I ask you the question, why should I believe that? Why should I believe that experience is the metaphysical certainty thing? Wow, words, right? Yeah.
So
Yeah.
So I would say, because you experience it, it needs no rationale, it needs no explanation, it needs no justification. The experience itself is the I forget what you used, unmoved mover or uncontingent,
Oh.
the whatever you define those properties of God as, it's just absolute. It is a philosophical primitive. No justification matters at all. Logic doesn't matter, math doesn't matter. If there's a God, it doesn't matter. The fact that you experience is itself the fundamental truth that is uncontingent on anything else.
And yet, let's say that I simply say, no, it's not, you're mistaken. What kind of route can you go to get around that, essentially?
Get around your denial, because your denial isn't contingent on its truth. The truth is independent of your denial.
Certainly. Yes, absolutely. Actually, where do you get this idea that truth is not dependent on your epistemological state of being?
Because I can deny my own existence, yet I still exist.
Can you, or is that just the
Yes.
demon tricking you?
The demon tricking me into denying my own existence?
Yep.
Then I would still necessarily exist, because I'm experiencing the denial of the existence.
Why? Why does that follow? Why does that logic follow?
It doesn't follow. I don't need logic. I'm experiencing something. I don't care if it's logical or not.
But no, the reason.
I mean, the logic is only whether or not I believe it. I don't care if I believe I exist or not. The fact that I experience it is true regardless of the logic.
No,
if the
but
demon is convincing me, that's fine. I don't care. I'm still experiencing something.
Right. This is what I'm getting at, though, is that you are, if we kind of, I don't know, step above one level and look back down at what we are doing right now, and we see that you are making an argument about why, experience, you're giving reasons why experience is this kind of metaphysical bedrock. And now, granted, those reasons are totally independent and have nothing to do. They're independent of whether or not experience really is the metaphysical bedrock. That's the thing we absolutely agree on. But my point is that you, in even giving any kind of reason, in even saying that that it is outside logic, it is outside reason, it doesn't need those things. If the demon is going to allow you, is going to deceive you into, or can deceive you into thinking that things exist when they really don't exist, and that logical truths really are actually false, despite the fact that there is literally no way that we can think otherwise about those logical truths. Why would you have confidence?
I don't need confidence. I can believe I don't exist. That makes no difference. The fact that I have a belief, that I have an experience.
Right. Certainly. But what I'm saying is that let's say you doubt that you exist or whatnot. You don't believe so, but you actually are existing in the first place. You just are, kind of as a matter of fact. But nevertheless, you absolutely should not and do not think that experience is the metaphysical bedrock and that you're really there. And of course, you don't need to, because you actually are there. But then in you saying, I don't know that you can pick apart the kind of epistemological certainty between, you know, if it is, let me gather my thoughts.
I'd like to rephrase a part of my argument and just hear your thoughts on it. So,
Okay.
if logic is not A equals A, and there is some different kind of logic outside of our world, I still
or just no
experience,
logic.
or no logic. I still
Right.
experience. I'm still having an experience right now. Now, I don't care about the logic. The logic, even if there is a different logic, it doesn't stop me from having the experience. I'm still having an experience right now in this moment, and regardless of whatever the laws of logic are or are not, that experience is still there. Makes no difference if it's correct or accurate, or if I believe false things. No difference at all. The logic makes no difference at all. Whether or not there is a logic makes no difference at all. I am still having an experience regardless of anything else.
Right, absolutely. And
So
yet you have absolutely no reason to believe anything you just said.
yes, but I don't need a reason because I'm experiencing.
But that
Like, why do I need a reason? I'm experiencing. Why do I need a reason for the experience?
well, because the experience could be illusory.
That's fine. It's still an experience. Doesn't change the argument.
No, but it's not. An illusory experience is not an experience. In
What?
a world without logic, that's what I'm getting at. An experience, an illusory experience is not an experience.
That seems to be an assumption on your part, because we could be in a world without logic right now, and I'm still experiencing.
Well, then great. Although even see this is the going back to the kind of infinite cycle.
But that only applies to logic. We can't doubt the experience. We can only doubt the logic.
But you use the logic to get to the point where you can say that we don't need, or we don't doubt the experience, we just doubt the logic.
Well, that's like just because we can only think using logic. We can't use a different kind of logic. That's not because logic is true. That's because that's just how we speak. It's like our language. I can't communicate to you in a different kind of language because I don't know a different language. So I have to use English.
So then what
that doesn't mean English is the only language.
Oh, of course not. But
so there could be other kinds of
logic. Again, there's nothing, metaphysically necessary, or there's no requirements on what language must be like. And yet, granted, you might say there's no requirements on what logic must be like. But that, in and of itself, seems to kind of stop the conversation right there. Because if we don't have logic to go on, if we can doubt that logic itself is actually valid, then it seems like there we go. We absolutely cannot proceed with any kind of constructive conversation.
Well, that's where I would disagree, because just like where I say I am apparently holding a bottle of water, I can say logic apparently works like this. So I can say that we have logic in an apparent sense for our universe and our uses, just like I can say we have an experiential world for our apparent uses, without saying anything about the true fundamental nature of reality.
But even again, that line of reasoning is itself predicated on a kind of logic.
That's just because that's the language we use. That's not actually predicated on the logic itself. Like, for example, there could be a different kind of logic that we just don't know how to talk in, just like a different kind of language. And that different kind of logic is really what's causing the universe to work the way it is. And we're only expressing it in our version because that's how we talk. So it is not, the logic isn't predicated on our logic.
But do you not think that when we say that A equals A, do you not think that we are reflecting a kind of actual objective truth about the way things work and relate?
Oh, I think the world we experience probably is the absolute fundamental nature of reality. But my point is that we don't have a justification for that.
Then why do you think it?
Why do I that's just a personal belief. Like but I can't prove that the external reality is metaphysical, and I grant it could not be. I'm just going to say, okay, I just believe it is because reasons. I like it. It makes me feel good.
well, I don't necessarily think, I cannot psychologize into the mind of TJump. But I, at least if I could speak from my experience, I don't think that is why we take the external world to exist. I don't think it's a case that we have this kind of 50-50, well, maybe it's here, maybe it's not, and it's better for me if it's here, so I'll just kind of choose to act as though it's real. We really do have a sense about us that these things, the objective world really actually is here, and that when I'm interacting with something, I'm really actually interacting with something.
Oh yeah, I see where you're going. But yeah, that would go into my illusion argument where I showed you the picture of the Rubik's cube with the 3 colors that are the exact same. The fact that we experience it and we can't see it, it's real for us, doesn't actually mean it is real. It's just a feeling we have. And so from my perspective, any of those feelings that we think are real should start off as, well, that's probably an illusion until proven otherwise, whereas you seem to think, or you seem to say it as, well, that we should accept that as real until proven otherwise.
Okay, I see. Yeah. So then it's really back to assumptions. But again, it's kind of like a conversation stopper, because if everything, well, and I suppose at some point, I do believe certain things come back to simply an assumption. But if we are going to say that that's all it is, and that like we are not going to hold the belief that this is actually, that we're actually kind of getting at something, then I think that it's just utterly hopeless to try and progress with, say, because if we say that you typically assume things are illusory until they're
Demonstrated otherwise,
until they're demonstrated to not be illusory, whereas I take things to be real until they are demonstrated
to be illusory.
Right, to be illusory. It's kind of like, well, unless we...
But I think there's a reason that we can choose one of these over the other.
Right, and okay, and I assume that goes back to the imaginary, experiential.
Absolutely, we have a criteria to differentiate between the imaginary and the experiential, and so we can say, we can start with the illusory and then move to the experiential and say, okay, so now we have these 2 distinct categories. Whereas your category of the absolutely real, I don't see any way to differentiate either of these categories from that. So why can we just say, well, things just start as this absolute category when we have no way to actually determine anything is?
This is kind of the point that I was getting at before. It's not like the experiential and the imaginary are somehow like mind and body are on a substance dualist view. It's not like they're just utterly distinct from each other with no points of contact.
I agree, but I'm not sure. I don't think I'm following where you're going with this.
The experiential reality is a part of just the all-encompassing, just reality as a whole. It's an aspect of it. It's not something that's separate from it.
Oh, absolutely. I agree. I'm not saying there is no metaphysical reality. I'm saying there absolutely is a metaphysical reality. We just don't know anything about it. We know it exists. We know it's there. There is some absolute truth, but we can't say it's theism or pantheism or naturalistic pantheism or
no, but what I'm getting at is that we can go even further, at least, because again, it's not just that we know about imaginary and experiential reality and we suspect there could be a kind of absolute reality, but we can know nothing of it. It's that we can know something about that kind of ultimate reality because the experiential reality and the imaginary is part of that, all encompassing just things that are going on and things that
Oh yeah, absolutely. I agree. That's where
are.
I think therefore I am comes in. That's the only metaphysical truth which ties into the experiential and the imaginary. It's both things that you experience. And so if you want, we can grant that logic and math are also metaphysical, but that still leaves us that there's no way to tell which one of those theories is correct. Theism, pantheism, naturalistic pantheism. There's no way to tell the difference.
Oh yeah, based off of that. No, there's no, I don't think there is.
And so then my question to you would be, what evidence do we have that can indicate the metaphysical indicates theism opposed to all the others?
Right. Well, I think that, oh boy, we're going to get back to the moral argument. Maybe not the moral argument. I think I don't believe that I have any kind of logical proof, as in like strictly logical, like that kind of logical certainty, that there is a God. I just don't. I simply don't. But for me, what I have is that I find it more reasonable than not. Certain things seem like well, let's go back to the moral argument.
All right.
It seems like pantheism could kind of suffer from the same problems as I see something like moral or atheistic moral Platonism, something like that, or just naturalistic atheistic moral realism, where on pantheism, you know, obviously just everything is God, which first of all, I might I would almost object to saying that might just be a distinction without a difference, to just say I don't know. Yeah, right. And thus, you know, to kind of.
So what would be the problems with morality that you see there?
Right. The problems would be that these sorts of things, naturalism or pantheism or abstract moral Platonism, I think, they don't give as satisfactory of an account of morality, of things like moral values and duties.
What do you mean by satisfactory? Do you mean like it just feels better to us?
No, I mean like, so every kind of moral theory or whatnot is going to have some starting point, some, again, fundamental bedrock thing that you can't get beyond it. It just is the ground for morality. So I think, like, for example, atheistic moral Platonists believe that, you know, moral values are just Platonic objects that exist in this abstract kind of realm.
Well, I brought up naturalistic pantheism and said morality is a super law of nature. Can you go with that one?
Yeah, sure. The super law of nature. It seems that is completely lacking in explaining any kind of objective moral duties that we might have. So I'll even grant. I'll even grant. Let's say that there are just kind of intrinsically good things and intrinsically bad things, morally speaking. So that would be consistent with a kind of super law of nature, and it would be consistent with naturalism. That it's just inherent to reality to be morally bent in certain ways. Nevertheless, that doesn't explain whatsoever why we would have any kind of obligation to follow what is good or what is bad or anything like that. So let's say that, justice exists out there.
Let me ask, how does God explain? How does God give us, or a theistic God give us a solution to those problems?
Well, because our obligations would come from commands or trying to think of a better word than commands, because that makes it sound rather arbitrary.
Well, I'll just say, let's say commands. Well, what is the difference between the commands and some kind of force like gravity that just permeates the universe? Why would we be obligated based on commands and not be obligated by the force? What's the difference?
Because one is a person and the other is not a person. And specifically, I'll go more into that. Because you don't owe a duty to a kind of non-sentient thing. Like or at least I won't go that far, because that might be begging the question. To all, of our experience, we see that we find it nonsensical that I could have a moral obligation to my water bottle. That does not make sense whatsoever. Because in a sense, you would just ask the question, obviously, well, like, why? It's not like the water bottle is made any different or affected in any way by me, drinking from it or hitting it with a baseball bat. For whatever reason, I might want to hit it with a baseball bat.
Let me interrupt for a second. So from my perspective, the obligation would be to the other person, like, because moral interactions are interactions between persons. So I would say that your obligation isn't to some higher authority, it's to the other person who you're doing the moral action to. So you could still have obligation in pantheism. It would just be an obligation to the other moral actors rather than to the supreme being.
But well, then that would be how, if it's not simply an agreement between or a kind of internal or social agreement with people, how can it be anything more than a social agreement with people, essentially? If it is, if you do have these or your obligations lie with other people, not necessarily other inanimate objects or unconscious objects.
Well, I'd say the morality itself would be grounded in the super law, and then the obligations would be a result of those, the nature of the super law, and then those would be applied to other people. You have obligations to other people, but the morality itself is grounded in the super law.
No, but I think that is where the disconnect is, though, because you have these moral values which are given from the super law. But just because something is morally good or morally bad, it doesn't immediately follow that therefore certain things are morally right or morally wrong, that I have an obligation to do this instead of that or this other kind of thing.
You lost me there a little bit, because when you say morally good and morally bad and morally right and morally wrong, as far as I'm concerned, those are just total synonyms. Like, if I see I can help someone or I can hurt someone, I don't help them because someone told me to. I don't help them because I'm obligated to some authority. I help them because it's the right thing to do. Just full stop.
So for example, though, maybe the difference could be outlined in this. It could be morally good for me to become a doctor, It could also be morally good for me to become a firefighter. It could also be morally good for me to become a police officer. But that doesn't, just because they're good, that doesn't mean that therefore it is right. It is the right thing for me to do morally to become a firefighter, or the right thing to do to become a police officer. They're all good things, but that doesn't in and of itself establish an obligation, establish that, therefore I need to become, or I'm obligated to become a firefighter or a police officer, or even any of them.
I'm not quite following. I don't get
Okay.
why you would. Why would you be obligated to become a firefighter or a doctor or something? I don't understand.
Oh no, the point is that you wouldn't.
Yeah, but you're saying in theism you have some obligation. So hypothetically, you would have an obligation to do something like become a firefighter or a doctor in theism. So how does theism give you that obligation? I don't get it.
Well, it's because if you imagine a kind of person with a plan, then what is, right for you is essentially fulfilling your role in that plan.
For me, that doesn't seem like morality. That seems more like slavery.
Unless you believe that the commands themselves are reflections that stem from this kind of morally perfect source, of on the scale from morally horrible to morally bad to morally good to morally perfect, this being would be morally perfect. And the obligations would flow, his commands, or oh wow, God's commands would flow from his moral nature, but they might not be
So let me just go with what you've said so far. You said that God has a plan. Let's say that the moral super law of nature has an apex or epitome outcome, which is like the best of all possible worlds for all possible wills, and therefore doing what is moral is obligated to try and get to that point, the instantiation of the perfect world or whatever. So that
right.
would just be like,
I would just disagree that a super law can have a kind of quote unquote best outcome or something, because it seems to me that value judgments like best or worst are ultimately related to some kind of consciousness. That, with respect to my water bottle, or even, well, no, let's go my water bottle. Whether or not slavery happened, just from the, I guess, non-existent point of view of the water bottle, it just doesn't matter. There's no experiencer there to even, give any kind of value of best or worst or anything like that. So to say best or worst is to impose a kind of consciousness upon this super law. But at that point, you're just getting very close to what theists call God.
couldn't morality just be an emergent property? Like no drop of water has the property of ocean intrinsically in it, but if you add enough drops of water, you get an ocean. So morality is sourced in things that are non-personal, and the fact that it affects personal beings is only emergent property.
I think that the fundamental disconnect, though, with the emergent properties is that the emergent properties are all the just of the descriptive type, as opposed to prescriptive. As as a matter of fact, one molecule of H2O is not an ocean. As a matter of fact, a lot of H2O very well could be an ocean. But we're trying to make the jump from,
Facts to values.
Yes, but I suppose again, it's these moral values stemming from a kind of uh, consciousness. In like, you know, if there's a super law, which kind of, or let's just say it's kind of fundamental to reality to just have those kinds of valuations of certain things are morally good or morally bad. It see in all honesty, perhaps I mean I can, you know, for worst case scenario, kind of describe this as, let's say, incredulity on my part. But I don't even know what it means. I can't, I literally cannot fathom what it even means to say that something is just morally good or morally bad in a world of rocks. And if a super law of nature exists and the universe is itself fundamentally permeated with moral valuations of good and bad, certain things are good and certain things are bad, it seems like it simply, there could not have been moral goodness or moral badness before any kind of sentience. So that if rocks were all that existed, and I think Sam Harris uses this example, but if rocks were all that existed, it's like to speak of morality would be nonsensical. And now I can imagine, I don't know if you are thinking of saying this, but I can imagine someone saying, well, the morality kind of only applies to
Persons.
yeah, to persons. Why think that?
Well, I could say there could be a morality of rocks that we just haven't discovered yet.
But really though, I mean, this again is kind of, I sure, let's grant that there's a kind of logical possibility that maybe we're mistaken and maybe rocks can have a system of morality. But again, why? Certainly you would think that it's more plausible than not to think that rocks are utterly devoid of morality. I mean, morality as we
Yeah, we can grant that. That was just what came
conceptualize.
into my head. So let's say rocks don't have morality.
Right, right. So why are people special according to this super law?
Well, why, like if we have just a world of rocks, the idea of an ocean is just as nonsensical. Like that only applies to planets and large bodies of water, but if all we have is rocks, there is no water. But then when those rocks go into a sun and get compressed and made into hydrogen and oxygen atoms and get launched out into space and become water in an ocean, the fact that it was nonsensical before the ocean existed doesn't mean that that universe can't produce the result.
Right, right. Certainly. But what I'm getting at is what is it about uh, humans? Essentially, the point I'm getting at is that all of these things, all of these examples with water and rocks and all that, those are, and actually, I shouldn't, I shouldn't put the blame on you for bringing up the rocks because that was me. But the reason or the nature of the kind of drop of water versus an ocean, or you know, we might even say pebble versus a planet or something. Maybe that's a worse example, but those are just descriptive facts about things. And morality simply seems like almost the inverse of a descriptive fact. It's not stating it's not stating how something is. It's stating the ideal way for something to be. And
Isn't that a descriptive fact, the ideal way something should be?
I think that ultimately is dependent on a person. I might side with Hume in this sense, in that I do not, it does not make sense to me to talk about morality, which is inherently about what is best versus what is worse, what is morally reprehensible versus morally beneficial or praiseworthy. You know, praiseworthy, blameworthy, those kinds of things. How can
You still there?
yeah. How can something which, to all appearances, seems so neutral, so just utterly neutral to things as the objective world, you know, no physical object here seems to care whatsoever about anything. And the reason that, they don't necessarily have any moral concerns or whatnot is because they just don't even have any concerns in the first place, because they don't experience anything.
Okay, let me give you my view of morality. I think I can answer that.
Okay.
So imagine you have two worlds. One world is a world where there are lots of large rocks that can fall and break your legs, and the other world is where large rocks fall and they don't break your legs. I would say that the world where the rocks fall and break your legs is more immoral than the world where it doesn't. And now there's no evil agent in those situations. I just think the world itself, because it is likely to have the effect of immoral action imposition on you, makes the world itself more immoral.
So, well, then it seems like you're kind of simply, well, why? First of all, I'll say that. Why?
Well, I think an immoral action is any involuntary imposition on will. So if you have a rock fall on you and you didn't want that to happen, that's immoral.
Okay, and how about like moral goodness or whatnot? I just to get the flip side of that,
or just be helping someone to achieve their will, essentially.
Oh, okay. So again, it seems like the one thing that's common to both good and bad in what you have said is a will.
Yes, but you don't need the things can do immoral or moral actions independent of the will. Like you can have the world itself is immoral, regardless of the fact that it has a will, because it imposes on wills.
Repeat that again.
The world itself can be immoral because it restricts the will by crushing your leg. And so the world itself doesn't need to have a will to be immoral. So morality is not contingent on wills. It's only to them.
So would you, are you saying that the world as a whole is like being immoral?
I wouldn't say being, I just said is immoral. So I don't think immorality is contingent on wills at all. I just think any involuntary restriction of will is immoral. So
but in what sense would the world be immoral?
By comparison to other less immoral worlds that don't restrict will.
Okay, but again, it's...
So from my perspective, the objective standard of morality, because I do believe in objective morality and I wrote a model about it. And so in my view, objective morality is the best of all possible worlds for all possible wills. And that is the objective standard of morality. And anything that deviates from that is immoral, and the more it deviates, the more immoral it is. And we can judge worlds based on how immoral they are, based on how far they are away from that ideal.
And so I can already see how there would be an inherent answer to the kind of question I'm going to bring up here. But so I assume that the reason why, you know, Adolf Hitler or something, that his, you know, the fulfillment of his will would ultimately be seen as morally bad rather than good because, you know, well, his will was fulfilled because he was imposing on the wills of millions of others.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, though, so it seems like you're saying that the world, quite literally, the world is not neutral.
Yes.
That is what you're saying.
Yep.
Okay. Yes.
That's kind of the point of the super law of nature.
Right. Again, I simply, it simply seems that valuations, value judgments, value in general, it, it, it does not seem like, you know, there could be some kind of just ethereally existing value just split up in kind of like just there, just value. It really, in at least all of our experience, seems that value is dependent on, like I said, people, in that it is valuable because it is essentially valuable to me. Now, granted, that's from my point of view. If that was all morality was just my opinion versus, or my beliefs on morality versus yours and everybody, that would obviously be subjective. But how it's like, it seems fundamental to the nature of values to be reliant, it's like, if there is this world here and it's just, it has a kind of value attached to that. It's almost like, who, this is an improper question, but you could ask something like, who's the recipient of this value? What is this value going towards? Like, it's value in some sense, but it seems like it's value in no sense that we are familiar with at all. It
Well,
seems
I would
like,
say that we're the recipient, or any person would be the recipient, and it would be leading towards the best of all possible worlds for all possible wills. I mean, it seems like you could make the same argument about water and say, well, why is this water being made? Who is this water for? And well, we drink water because it's very convenient for us, but that doesn't mean that the water exists for us.
well, right, certainly it doesn't.
And we could say the same
Well,
thing about
you could.
morality, that morality is just a thing that exists as a super law and it happens to
Oh,
affect
yeah,
us.
yeah. I didn't mean, when I asked the question of, like, like, who is receiving the value or something, I didn't mean to imply that, like, we were those people, like how you could think that water exists and we drink it and it's really good, so like, how could it not be made for us or something. What I mean is that, kind of like a perspective. If I have if I have a view on something, and I think that, I don't know, maybe the death penalty is wrong, and another person says, well, actually, I'm okay with the death penalty in certain cases. We espouse incompatible views, obviously, so one of us has to be wrong at least, and one of us has to be right. So it seems like from your point of view, the answer to that, let's say something like the death penalty is really wrong. Let's just say that it is. It seems that you're almost devoiding any kind of like, you're getting rid of any kind of moral, I don't know, ultimate moral reason or whatnot. I don't know if that's the best way to phrase it, but if you say, why is the death penalty wrong rather than not wrong, it seems like it just fundamentally goes back to, well, just because it is. And that's it. It's just wrong because it is. And now granted, the theist is, I will completely admit, the theist is in a similar position. I wholeheartedly admit that, because the theist ultimately grounds morality in the nature of God, which is itself a kind of just existing thing. But the reason why I would prefer a conscious source for this morality as opposed to an unconscious source is simply because it makes better sense of our moral experience, in that, like I said, we see morality as being dependent or as being intricately related with conscious beings, that it only concerns conscious beings. That is, now maybe it's logically possible that there's other, there's rock morality or whatnot, but for all intents and purposes, we see it that really morality only applies to sentient beings.
To me, that seems kind of like the argument with the water. We see water and we drink water. It's only useful for us. The rocks don't really care about it. Water only has a use for living things. Does that mean that water was designed for living things, or could it just be an emergent property? Like, for example, morality could just be an emergent property that happens to affect us, just like water happens to be useful for living things.
Well, hang on. Did you say that morality?
What?
Wait, yeah. Go.
So morality can be an emergent property, just like oceans are an emergent property. The fact that they are useful for living beings doesn't mean that that oceans are an intrinsic property associated with living beings, or that they were designed for living beings. It just happens to affect living beings in this way. And morality could be the same thing. Morality is a result of a law that doesn't care anything about us, but it happens to have this effect of values in us.
Right. And this again, I think what you are describing is precisely what I'm trying to get at, which is that is not morality. That just simply isn't morality. Our
Can you
experience
explain in a little bit more detail? What do you mean that isn't?
Yeah. Our experience of morality is not simply as kind of a tool that we use to get along. I mean,
just to pause right there, you said our experience of morality, but why does our experience of morality matter? Because we have an experience of water being good for us. That doesn't mean water is designed for us. So why does our experience of morality define what it is?
Well, see, in the case of water, you have water. It's our experience that it helps us. That doesn't necessarily mean that it was designed for us. That's kind of separate from what I was saying. I wasn't necessarily arguing that, we experience morality a certain way, or we think that morality is helpful for us or whatnot, so therefore it must have been designed for us. All I'm getting at is that oh, good grief, I'm losing my train of thought. Good grief. All I'm getting at is that to say that morality is just a kind of almost, you could even think of it as a kind of just not necessarily a byproduct, because it wouldn't, it's a super law, but in essence, just a kind of another part of nature, just another kind of way things are. And that just does not seem like what morality is. And
Let me ask you a different thing. So
yeah,
my view of morality is the best of all possible worlds, which is a world where everyone has total freedom to achieve their own will, and no one else can restrict them, and nature can't restrict them. They just have total freedom to achieve their will as long as they don't impose upon the freedom of others.
okay.
Now, in my view, that is the epitome of morality. And then if we compare that to the Christian epitome of morality, where there's, like a hell and suffering and people being forced to live in a world that causes them immense suffering, from
Yeah.
my perspective, my view seems far more moral than the Christian worldview, even though it doesn't have a being.
Well, now remember that this is, whatever this kind of reminds me of someone, objecting to the moral argument because of, atrocities in the Old Testament Bible or something like that. It's just
Yeah,
kind of a
problem with
side. Well, right, but it's just kind of beside the point for the moral argument, though, because
that's what I'm trying to get at. I think from
right.
the way I assess morality, for me, what morality is, whatever it is, makes that my world that I describe without suffering is morally superior to the Christian worldview.
Gotcha.
Because it allows suffering. So I'm trying to just approach the same problem from a different angle to see if I can get a better understanding of your position.
Or wait, did you say something about allowing suffering?
Yeah, like in the Christian worldview, he created a world with suffering. So he allows people to suffer against their will in his worldview. And that's supposedly his purpose, or I forget what you said, the outcome he envisions, your obligation to do things. Whereas in my worldview, the purpose or the reason for doing things is the best of all possible worlds for all possible wills. And that, to me, based off whatever morality is, seems far more moral than the Christian worldview because of suffering.
Well, let's remember, though, that we're ultimately talking about the grounding for morality. So regardless of whether, a certain thing is morally better or morally worse, or like, the killing of the Canaanites was horrible, and, on my view, it was horrible, but on Christianity, it's not horrible. That kind of a thing. We could even just kind of get rid of the Christianity issue and just restrict it back to theism, which then you would point to suffering. That kind of leads in a different area. But either way, I suppose I don't.
Well, I'm curious to know more about your your approach to the problem of suffering, because I think it'll help me to understand more about what you mean by morality. Because you said the nature isn't morality, the kind of morality I'm describing isn't morality. So, and I say it is morality, and so I want to say, here is my view of morality, and here is your view of morality. Where are the differences? Because it seems like my view is more moral because it entails a goal where there isn't suffering, and your view has lots of suffering, so your view seems more immoral to me.
Right. Here is the fundamental problem with why I don't think what you're talking about is morality, and it's because even talking about an end goal on this super law kind of a thing. If the super law is not conscious, and so it can't, come up with decisions of what is better, what is not better, then it seems like to say, the best possible outcome or whatnot. If we're talking about outcomes, then how is it more than simply us reaching a state of pure description in which this person's will is, restricted as little as possible. Everyone's will is restricted as little as possible. And that is the state of things. That is simply just the way things are. Why should we jump further and say, not only is that the way things are, but it's good that things are this way. It is better that things are this way.
Well, I think the obligation lies in the persons being affected. So it's better because the persons have the unrestricted will. That's what makes it moral. So for me, that's just the definition of morality.
Because it's kind of dependent on what the person themselves finds as better, essentially.
Well, it would just be value as a whole. It doesn't matter what you subjectively find important or not. That doesn't matter. It's just your freedom of will is itself a moral absolute.
Well, but okay, what do you mean by a moral absolute? Do you mean that it is kind of the barometer of an obligation or something?
Yeah, that is value. That is morality. That is obligation. It just is your freedom of will. You're not having any involuntary restrictions of your will. That is morality from my perspective. That is the definition of morality.
Ooh. Okay, I could interpret that a couple different ways. Do you mean that it is morally best for people to be in a state of freedom, kind of without limitation, as long as they don't harm others?
Yes.
Or right, so that's the morally best.
Yes.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that, that is literally kind of the definition of what it means to be morally good, or what moral goodness is itself. It seems like morality, whatever morality is, would be the thing which says that, yes, the kind of lack of imposition on wills is good, but it doesn't seem like it is literally identical to a state in which a person's will is not being imposed.
I think this goes back to the difference between the theist worldview and the atheist worldview, where the atheists start from a bottom-up position of here's what we imagine, here's what we experience. So things, for me, objective morality would be defined as that state of affairs, the best of all possible worlds for all possible wills, where people aren't, no involuntary restrictions of will. That, for me, is morality. The source couldn't care less. Whatever the source is, it could be a super law, it could be a god, makes no difference to me whatsoever. That's what morality is.
But what I'm saying, though, is morality is not, the least, no imposition on wills or whatnot. Morality. No, I mean,
what is your definition of morality?
Least imposition on wills is good. And we could even agree that it is the morally best thing. I don't know. I'd have to, look into kind of what I think about that, because I haven't thought about that much as like a moral ideal. But I'll grant that, let's say that is the morally best thing. To say that is the scenario which is morally best is to say that scenario kind of lines up. It is I see. What I was essentially thinking was that to say that it's morally the best is to say that it follows. It is a, the natural outcome of whatever moral principle or moral rule says or determines that that is the best. But so to say that goodness, moral goodness, is a state in which there is no imposition on any will, that does not allow for any kind of gradation. As in, like, what if everybody's will is perfectly free except for one person, and it's just like their will is kind of imposed upon sometimes because they're only allowed to have 3 cookies instead of 2, or 3 cookies instead of 4.
Yeah, because they only want 2 cookies. They're being forced to have 2 cookies.
Yeah, exactly. No, but
so that would be less moral than a world where they could have as many cookies as they want.
right. So it would still be morally good, just not quite as morally good as what the literal ideal would be.
I mean, I guess that depends on how you look at it, because I would just say the moral extreme is ultimate morality and everything below that is immoral. But that you could just say it's less moral too. That would just mean the same thing, I guess.
Okay, but then what I'm saying is that moral goodness is the thing that is in most abundance in the morally best world.
Yes,
right?
I think so.
But it is not literally identical to the morally best world. Just definition wise, it is the thing which the morally best world contains, but it is not literally the morally best world.
Oh yeah, the morality itself was defined as no involuntary restriction of will. That is the moral principle.
Right. And so that is what is, if that is followed, it is morally good to follow it.
Yeah, and it would lead to the best of all possible worlds.
Right. But it is not itself literally identical to the best possible world.
Yeah, you can say the source of this principle comes from the super law.
Right. Wow. I don't know what happened, but I totally just lost my train of thought. Wow. I don't know what happened. But in all honesty, we can let's say I actually have a haircut a little bit later. But maybe if we want to talk until like 1:30 something.
All right. 1:30 your time. Okay.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, so just at the 30 mark.
All right.
Pretty much. Okay. Yeah, because I totally forgot where my line of thinking was going.
Well, I'd really like to talk about the problem of suffering, if you don't.
Yeah, absolutely.
So from my worldview, best of all possible worlds, no restriction of will. This world has restriction of will. Therefore, the theist definition of morality seems immoral to me.
Right. But of course, that's assuming that this hypothetical best possible world in which no one's wills are restricted at all can exist with as much good as another world. So like we can have a world in which there is one person, just one person. So by definition, he is going to have, no imposition of will because it's just him. But is that better than a world with 100 people with, unimposed upon wills, where one of them just has a slight imposition with the whole cookie thing? He has 3 instead of 4. I don't know that necessarily is.
My definition was the best of all possible worlds for all possible wills.
Okay. Right. But
so everybody has total freedom, no restriction, do whatever you want, go for it.
But in essence, what I'm talking about is that, such a world doesn't, it seems either impossible on the one hand, or if we're going to grant that such a thing is possible, it seems that it could not possibly, because of its implications, carry the same amount of goodness as, you know, a world in which it might not be possible for everyone to have unimposed upon wills. So what I mean is that, let's, you know, what about people with conflicting wills, where my will is to have this piece of pizza, but this other person's will is also to have this piece of pizza?
Think about a video game. Like if you want a piece of pizza, you can just press a button, piece of pizza, and if the other person wants a piece of pizza, they can just press a button, piece of pizza. So everybody gets through. It's like a computer game or the internet. Everybody has total control over the environment, godlike, omnipotent powers to summon and create universes. Everybody gets their own universe. You can do collective universes, whatever you want. Everybody's total freedom, total freedom.
Right, but then I don't think you've read much Merleau-Ponty, as I said before, but or I talked about Merleau-Ponty a bit on the last thing. But his whole point about freedom, which I think is a really good point, is that, you know, this kind of unlimited godlike power, that does not give you freedom in the kind of sense that we like. It would not allow for any kind of meaningful accomplishment on your part, or
well, I have the freedom to live in a world exactly like this one with the exact same restrictions that this one has. That's just my choice. Except
for the fact that you can just at will kind of say, okay, it's too much, get me out of here.
Or I could restrict myself from having that possibility and just lock myself in this world if I want to. The only difference is between the world I'm suggesting and the theist world is that you choose whether or not you want to be in a world where you experience involuntary suffering. If you don't choose it, you won't be placed there. But you can live in a world exactly like this one. You can live with the Christian God. You can live in his world that he created. Freedom to choose. That's the only difference.
And you can also live with, you know, I mean, you can live and do immoral things, though, if you would want.
Well, from my definition, an immoral thing would be an involuntary imposition of will, which would just be literally impossible in this world unless someone consented to it, in which case it wouldn't be involuntary.
Right. So let's say, though, that I wish to control you.
Couldn't do it. That would be an involuntary imposition of will.
Oh, right. Right. So that's something I could not do.
Yes, you have freedom of will so long as you do not impose upon the freedom of others. That is the limitation.
Yeah. Sounds like a nice place.
It does. It does.
It really does. It really does sound like a nice place. Yeah.
And from my perspective, that's probably the main reason I don't believe in an all good, all powerful God, because, you know, I can think of a better world than the one he supposedly created.
Yeah, but again, there's, you know, there does seem to be something. It seems like we need a kind of restriction, right? I mean, like restriction on power, not necessarily restriction on morality, for certain things to
be meaningful.
Well,
I would agree with you.
Not just just be meaningful, but also, you know, meaningful to like the fullest extent. So, you know, if I'm in a world where, oh gee, this is difficult to come up with an example.
Well, I know exactly what you're saying. I totally agree. And I think that you should have the right to be able to place those kinds of restrictions on yourself if you want to experience that kind of meaning and fulfillment. But if someone doesn't want to place those kinds of restrictions on themselves, they should have the freedom not to. And I think that is a more moral situation than the being forced to have those restrictions placed on you, which I would see like slavery.
Yeah. So I guess maybe this is what I'm really trying to get at, because I am, I'm not a strictly a Kantian when it comes to ethics, but I do place a lot of moral weight on things like intentional states and whatnot, so that, if I if I really truly, think to myself, man, I would love to just slit that kid's throat or something like that. And let's say I actively choose to think that. Well, okay. All right. Yeah.
So you're saying the thought itself is immoral, and
Well, yes, my almost decision to think that, my wanting to do that, is itself immoral. Now, that undoubtedly comes back to the question of free will, because if we don't have free will, then
you wouldn't be to blame.
certainly I don't think that, I don't think that intentional states would be morally significant whatsoever if free will doesn't exist. Granted, I actually don't think that anything would be morally significant if free will didn't exist, but that's a separate thing.
From my position, I don't see any. There can be no immoral thoughts. There's no thought crime in my worldview. It's only immoral impositions of will. So I don't think you can think anything immorally.
Right, and yet, is it better to believe that Hitler did something good or that Hitler did something horrible?
I don't think your belief on the matter is moral or immoral either way.
So
you can believe whatever you want to believe. It makes no difference to me. As long as you're not actually restricting anyone's wills, it's not immoral.
So if I just kind of, harbor this hatred for all other races, and everywhere I go, I'm going around and I'm constantly reminding myself how much superior I am to these savages and animals and whatnot. Going around with that kind of mentality is no more morally worse than going around with a mentality of, we're all created equal. We should love each other.
I see no difference at all. I don't.
You see no moral difference between those two things.
I think it would be immoral for me to try and force you to change the way that you choose to think. You have a right to choose for yourself the way you think.
So even further, you go that not only is it not immoral for me to think that a certain race of people is inferior to my race, not only is it not immoral to feel that, it's actually, on the flip side, immoral for the person, for another person to
try and stop you or change your mind.
To try and stop me from thinking that. Now, granted, I do think there is a truth in the last part of that, in that, that's the kind of healthy idea of tolerance, in that, though I disagree with what you say, I'll defend to the death your right to say it. And I agree with that. But I think the reason why we would speak up, if I met someone who thought that, white people were just the greatest thing since sliced bread, maybe we've been around a little longer than that, but nevertheless, if I met somebody like that, I would feel compelled to try and you know, I wouldn't be compelled to yell at them and scream at them or whatnot, but I'd be compelled to just think and talk to them and be like, why in the world do you think this? And to, you know, say that, you know, that is really morally reprehensible to place yourself above all of these other people of other races simply because you are this certain race. That, to me, placing yourself above there, that just, it's like, if that's not immoral, I don't know, that seems like the prime example of something that would be immoral, is me placing myself above another person simply because of, say, their gender or the color of their skin, something like that.
Well, I don't see that as immoral at all. I think you should have the right to choose to believe or feel whatever you want to choose to believe or feel. It makes no difference. As long as you don't impose upon those people or restrict their will in any way, I see no problem with any belief you could possibly have. You have the freedom to choose to believe anything you want. I don't see any difference at all.
And yeah, that is interesting.
Because I see that as more like kind of like a thought crime. You're trying to convict someone of thinking.
Right. Well, but see, I mean, see it as a reflection of obviously the person's character, and you know, there's this might almost be going into like Aristotelian virtue ethics or something, but you know, the idea that myself, I can be morally better or morally worse, and it's morally better for me to be a person who believes that we are all equal.
But isn't by saying that, aren't you placing yourself above all of the people who you think are immoral?
Only in the sense that I think I am correct and I believe that they are incorrect, but I am not placing myself above those people in the sense that I think I have more value, more kind of worth than they do. That we're all equally, you know, equally worthy of existing. I just think that, as a matter of fact, you know, I have something correct that they have incorrect. And that's pretty much it.
Well, I think they would probably say the same thing about you if they believe that one race was better than the other. They probably think that you were factually incorrect for some reason or another.
Oh, I think they would view that I was factually incorrect. But additionally, if I was a black person, they would think that I wasn't worth as much as well. That's kind of...
Why should we judge their thoughts as being immoral? Like, what? Their thoughts can't ever affect you. As long as they can't.
It's because of the sentiment behind the thought. It's the idea that another person is just, lesser than me, of less worth than me, of less moral worth than me. And it's kind of like, just, I don't know.
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic, and I think I should be better to spend more time thinking about it and come back to it later. Yeah. It's almost 1:30, so you got to go.
Oh, true. You're right. I didn't even notice that. Thank you for catching that.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, this is a really interesting conversation. I'm definitely going to think more about it and check back in with you in a few weeks, see if we can.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try and get my profile picture.
I don't know. I like the blue guy. He's pretty good.
That's true. He is pretty nice. He's simple, you know? He's a simple guy. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for having the conversation again.
Yeah, absolutely. It was really nice talking with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I love having these conversations with you.
Yeah. They are fun.
Yep. All right. See you later.
See ya.